Alright guys, it's Ben here, and this is going to be a video response to Dave, also known as Infected Flinch, who's asked a question, and the question is story important in video games? And this one tickled my fancy, shall we say. Now, this isn't as easy as you think to answer actually, but the first thing to say is that you can get rid of story. You can have absolutely no story whatsoever, not even an iota of story or narrative, and still have a bloody good game. Now, I think that is more traditionally an old school approach to video games. You know, if you look at some of the good games that I, or a lot of you guys will have liked back in the day, on systems like, what, the Atari 2600, maybe even the NES, maybe stuff like that. Old arcade games, Pac-Man, Space Invaders. Those games don't really have a story. I mean, you could possibly try to squeeze some narrative out of that in that, well, what, aliens are invading? That's what Space Invaders' story is, or Pac-Man is lonely and he's going on a quest for self-discovery. Or actually maybe he's a massive druggie and all those little pills are getting him increasingly high. It's like Train Spotting, but you know, before that. Anyway, I'm going really badly off on a tangent here. I've not rehearsed any of this, so this is all coming off a bit weird. I think the point I'm trying to make is that in an old school sense, back in the day, some of the really, really good games that I was addicted to, they didn't really have any plot, or any story at all, or any narrative. If I was to take some of my favourite 2600 games, you know, like Galaxian or River Raid, those were games of skill and progression and of high score, but there wasn't any story involved. And so I think that has to be the first point. You don't need any story if you don't want to. And actually, I think that some of the modern games, some of the modern indie games, some of the modern Steam games are trying to recapture that kind of in you go, have a go, difficulty, games that test your skill, old school thing, where actually it can often more be about practice and a challenge and trying to crack on through things and a dexterity skill rather than a narrative. So yes, that's point number one. However, one of the biggest or most important parts for me and of modern gaming is now developing worlds that immerse you. And the central part to that is the narrative, is the story, and more importantly is the character that you can play as and develop as. Now, you know, the difference for me between a game that I'll play a little bit and get bored, or a game that I'll play and get addicted to and take through to completion, is pretty much 100% the story. If there's a story there that can grip me, if there's characters that I believe in or I actually want to know something about, I will play that game and I will finish it because it's addictive. This is probably one of the areas where Pokemon falls down, a series that I've loved so much, but they've invested so little effort into the narrative that it starts to almost fall flat. You know, I always seem to come back to the same kind of groups of games. If I give you an example of a game, Sleeping Dogs. Sleeping Dogs is a very good game. It's a game that I played through and finished very quickly. Why? Because the story grabbed me. It was all about kind of undercover cops and spying and gangs and betrayal, and it tied in so well that it got me playing and it got me just, I couldn't put the bloody thing down because of the story. Now, I think that historically there has been a temptation to just put story in because every game has to have one. So, you know, some of even FPS games don't really need one, but one gets tacked on. Probably because that's a half-assed attempt at recognising story is important, but people can't be bothered actually, you know, fully coming up with the world. And I think that's a thing of the past. Increasingly now, games have very complex, very important stories. And I've talked in the past in my list of people that I wanted to meet. I listed Rhiannon Pratchett, who writes stories for video games, and if you read some of the things that she talks about, the story writer often used to be like a troubleshooter. You'd make a game and be like, shit, this doesn't connect. How can you link this desert with the ancient ruins, with this sky fight with UFOs that we've made? And the story writer would have to come in and patch things up. But now you're starting your games with the story writer at the beginning and actually building your game from the ground upwards with the story as the central sort of binding factor, the web that holds it all together, or the cement or the concrete. And so your story designer, your narrative writer, your creative writer is there from the beginning and having an influence on how your game's going to pan out and how it's going to flow and what you're going to put in there. And increasingly that's becoming more and more the case. And I think that games that skimp on story lose out massively. And, you know, in this day and age now, I think that we have got to a level of graphical brilliance, and you know we're reaching that kind of point where yes, graphics will continue to increase, but the vast, massive, exponential jumps will now no longer be there. It's now going to be more subtle in terms of the progression that we get. So what do we rely on then if the graphics aren't going to be jumping huge amount now? It's the narrative. And that's the central thing to all of us, a lot of the entertainment that we have, films that we watch, the music we listen to, and the games that we play. They tell us stories and they take us somewhere. And that's why certain series, massive series like Final Fantasy are so big. It's because there was something in there that touched you. That's why I played The Last Story and loved it so much, that, you know, the story was just beautiful. The Last Story. I'm saying story too many times. And those JRPGs have a brilliant way of doing it. But saying that, sometimes the stories that we have in games, especially in JRPGs, are now starting to be cliched. And films seem to do this as well. A small number of kind of story patterns or tenets. There's a love thing in there, there's a loss thing in there, there's a redemption thing in there at the end. And it's getting a bit sickly and annoying. What's starting to weave through now, which is really fascinating and really where I start to like games, is telling your own story through the games. The story is not written for you. The game simply allows you to tell your own story or to weave your own story. That's why games that are free roaming like Skyrim are so important. You know, games that allow you to make choices, and actually maybe those choices aren't sensible, or maybe they're evil, or maybe they make the game more difficult. That doesn't matter. You should be allowed to make it messy and to have your own experience and to stamp some of your individuality on that game world. You know, maybe even some of the massive FPS games like Destiny have that in there. Your own progression, your own teams, your own story, if you like. And I liked games like Starbound. Again, that was in a sort of way, you have your bunch of people and you explore and you build together and you go off to planets, and it's creating a narrative that's completely within your own hands. It's down to you, and that's exciting. And just this final point then is about the power of interactive storytelling, which historically you would say it was a book. You know, if you go back to the R.L. Stein books where you turn to page 50 and then you can, do you go to the haunted ghost ride or do you go somewhere else? That is actually a type of game. And if you look on Steam, there are some interactive fiction games that are actually just stories that you click to progress through. The boundaries between games and storytelling now are getting very narrow, and it can be very blurred. The two things are so intimately linked now, story and gaming both becoming so close together, that they're both important to each other. Games are an important way of telling stories, and stories are a central tenet of games. One of the things that I really like is Twine, interactive storytelling software, and people are making some great games on that. Why? Because anybody can write a story and have imagination, and that can be a game, and it's allowing people just to make algorithms and make their own little games without having to be great at programming or great at graphics, because actually it's the power of the imagination that counts for the majority of the game, and that's giving the power back to the people. And I really want to make a game on Twine, a basic game. I've got some ideas in my head, but I'm not going to reveal too much about that. I'm never going to get around to doing it anyway because I'm too bloody busy. Anyway, that is my 2 pence on the importance of storytelling and stories and narrative in video games. Please check out the link to the original video by Dave, aka Infected Flinch, in the description below. Take care, guys. I'll speak to you all soon, and it would be great to hear from you. What do you think about this one? See you later.